This episode is in partnership with Moody's Analytics. Moody's on Climate Solutions deliver transparent and robust data, analytics and insights designed to integrate into your existing business workflows. The foundation of our value is data and our approach to financial quantification of risk. Navigate climate risk with confidence, trusted data, financial insight, better decisions.
Hello and welcome to this Moody's Analytics podcast. Known unknowns. We're putting climate scenarios into practice in a TCFD world. So my name is Christian Doherty and today we're looking at how climate scenarios are developing to meet the evolving needs of corporates and investors. Joining me today are three eminent speakers. We've got Leah Tadrowski, who's a director in Moody's Insurance Advisory Services team. She's joined by Alasdair Thompson, who's also director of research at Moody's Analytics. And finally, rounding things out, we have Leah Worrall, who is Deputy Head of Sustainable Investment in Insight at Isio. So perhaps we could kick off with a basic scene-setting question. Alasdair, can you give us a bit of an insight into what goes into the current climate scenarios and how important is it that your clients gain a better understanding of the process and the content?
Yeah, thanks, Christian. I think it definitely makes sense to start with some context, maybe some history. So the climate scenarios that are used by the financial sector actually build on quite a long history of scenario analysis by the scientific community, which has informed things like the assessment reports from the IPCC, for example. So these are developed into actually quite sophisticated models linking climate, energy systems and land use and macroeconomics over time. And these are calibrated by quite large teams of scientists. At the same time, we have organizations like the IEA, who have done quite detailed modeling and projection of the energy system and its links to the macroeconomy. So what groups like the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, have done is to take all of that work and that history of modeling and work with a number of different academic research groups to tailor these scenarios for use by the financial sector. And these scenarios are built up of a number of different layers. So starting with assumptions around the broad macroeconomic trajectory, so what are known as the shared socioeconomic pathways. These define things like the degree of competition or cooperation between different countries, the trend, productivity growth, demographics, factors like that. Then we layer on top what the assumed climate policy is going to be, which is the key differentiator in something like the NGFS framework. So that's things like whether the policy response is going to be immediate or delayed, whether it's coordinated or divergent, and whether it's aiming at something like a 1.5 degree scenario or 2 degrees and so on. Then we run a number of different integrated assessment models, that's these detailed energy system models, to optimize the path to reach those targets. And here we can get there in very different ways, depending on the assumptions that you make in things like the energy system modeling. So how much electric vehicles there will be versus hydrogen versus ICE and how quickly that will change, and what the energy mix will be and whether it's going to favor biomass or nuclear, things like that. Then once we know the path for emissions, we can convert that to temperatures through another climate model. And then we layer on our assumptions around what the kind of long-term physical damages will be. And again, we can make different assumptions there, whether we think it's going to be more or less extreme, depending on what your view is there. And then finally, we layer on the financial economics, so what we focus on, and think about some of the different costs of physical damages, of energy prices, of investment, and so on, and how those are going to impact on things like discount rates, on cost of capital, on returns for different asset classes. So the key point here really is that there are various critical leverage points in this sort of modelling cascade, which impact on the severity of the final result. And this layered approach means we can, to first order at least, sort of vary each of these individually. And there's so many layers of uncertainty, different unknowns here, and assumptions that we have to set. I think it's really important that users of these scenarios, have an understanding of that, and where you can play with these and where we're having to make assumptions, and don't just treat this as sort of a black box, or here is a sort of single definitive answer of this is what net zero looks like, or this is what a particular scenario looks like, because actually it's really important that there are lots of different ways to get there, and understanding that range is really important.
Absolutely. Okay. So Leah, there's obviously lots of work going on in this area. And as Alice said today, we're talking about known unknowns and unknown unknowns. From your perspective, what are the limitations of the current risk models? What do they fail to capture?
Very good question. So I guess it's important for investors to understand that there are limitations to the climate modelling that we are using as an industry, and these are common to the industry as a whole. Alasdair's just taken us through the sort of building blocks of what a climate model would typically entail, and it's relatively complex between the sort of transition, understanding the physical damage, understanding the macroeconomics, and then layering on the financials. So, ultimately these models necessarily need to be simplified for easy investor rollout. And this is slightly at odds with what the sort of scientific community are doing, which is extremely complex modelling, and it can take, several weeks to run simulations. One of the key areas that this has impacted on our understanding is in the case of sort of physical damages. There are many limitations to simplification, but this is one that the industry has focused on a lot this year. And essentially what we're doing is we're focusing a lot of the time on medium or average outcomes from these models. And that's really from a simplicity perspective and taking away key takeaways. But what this can do from the sort of physical damages perspective is ignore some of that tail risk or some of the potential sort of more catastrophic changes that could occur if we don't curb climate change. In particular, a key focus has been on climate tipping points, which is essentially where elements of the climate system may shift from one state into a completely different state. Taking one example would be permafrost melting. So when permafrost melts, it can release semi-permanently stored carbon and methane into the atmosphere, accelerating emissions, warming the planet further, causing further permafrost melt and temperatures beyond which permafrost can naturally reoccur as you get into this self-perpetuating cycle. Why is this so harmful to our understanding? Well, if we're significantly underestimating physical risks, what we're showing investors in terms of what the impacts on their portfolio could be may be significantly underestimated. And that's just something that investors should know, because I think a lot of the models at the moment that we're looking at, so taking an example, under a sort of 3+, 4+ degree scenario, predict a loss in GDP by the end of the century of around 20%. Some estimates are even much lower than 20%. Some say that actually such scenarios could be positive on the global economy. When integrating tipping points, that picture changes significantly. So in that case, we're talking at sort of 50 to 60% loss in GDP by the end of the century. You're essentially talking about worst case scenarios of climate catastrophe with unprecedented physical changes for our planet and pushing our societies and economies to the brink, really. That's just sort of one of the examples on the physical damages side.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, it's a sobering thought, and it's interesting to see, Laura, what's happening here from a customer viewpoint. I mean, what are the typical kind of conversations that you're having there around these scenarios?
As is probably clear now, I guess, from what Leah said and what Alasdair has said, there is a lot of complexity within the modelling. And most of us who are working in the financial services, have backgrounds as quants and have backgrounds as actuaries and are used to pricing typical financial instruments, thinking about market risk, thinking about life risk, underwriting risk, anything else we're used to thinking about, but we're not used to thinking about climate risk. Um, and we're probably, I don't want to speak for everyone, also not used to looking at the type of models that are being used for modeling that climate risk. So initially with our customers, a really big focus is on knowledge transfer and on trying to get them to understand the type of models that are used, the places where uncertainty remains, because it could be very easy just to get a set of climate scenarios, out of the box, and to not understand the level and the complexity of the assumptions on which those scenarios are conditional. And without that understanding alongside your scenario set, you're not really in the best position to understand how to use them, what questions to ask, how to modify them if there's a different type of exposure you should be looking at. So for us, a really, really, really big part of working with clients on this is helping them just to understand all of that modelling. And I suppose that within my role in the advisory services team, we really sit between the climate experts, the research team, the people who are able to go into all that modelling and understand it all in very fine detail, and the practitioners in the field. And as we know from, I guess, finance in general, there isn't always a great connection between the modelling and the theory, and then what people are actually done and what people are doing and how they need to be able to apply that theory to the real world. So most of my job is, again, that knowledge transfer and also helping them get to that application stage. This doesn't just mean us telling them everything. It usually involves the client asking lots and lots of questions, and making sure that they understand all of the assumptions that are there and that they communicate with us as well where they think those assumptions should be different. So it's really a back and forth, the knowledge transfer.
And what are the levels of understanding like there when it comes to those conversations? Are you surprised at the level of understanding and knowledge among your clients there, or is it quite a steep learning curve?
There's a very wide range. So on the one hand, we can work with clients who have never thought about climate risk before, are seeing these models for the first time, and they want to understand something maybe just at the first rung of the ladder level. They want to understand what the minimum they need to know is to begin the processes that they're starting. And right at the other end, we can work with clients who have, whole teams of climate actuaries. They know the models inside out. They have, PhDs and degrees in these subjects, and they want to go to a lot of detail. So we have the full range. There isn't really anything that's standard, but I would say that climate's new to all of us, with the exception of the climate actuaries who've really specialised in it. So that learning process is something that we've even been going through ourselves over the last year or two, and it's something that we're trying to be well equipped to support any range of clients through, regardless the level of technical knowledge that they have.
Absolutely. Okay. If I come back to you, Leah, one of the issues here, you touched on some of those scenarios, but and of course, one of the other sort of associated elements there is going to be transition risk, and what that looks like and what sort of challenges that presents to the economy generally and to individual businesses. In terms of the scenario models that are being developed, do you think they're delivering the necessary insight?
Yeah, probably not at this stage, being the short answer. But then the long answer is, essentially we are doing the best that we can at the moment. Going back to that governance and resourcing piece around what is possible. I think we briefly touched on physical risk, but on the transition risk side, there are equally a lot of issues. Many of the models that we're working with have significant reliance on carbon dioxide removal, for example, later this century, which essentially is, under the most stringent decarbonisation scenarios, for example, to achieve 1.5 degrees this century, which is in line with the most ambitious target of the Paris Agreement. They will rely significantly on approaches and technologies such as BECCS or bioenergy, such as biomass plants with CCS on top, carbon capture and storage to take emissions back out the atmosphere, or DACS, which is direct air capture and storage of emissions, or otherwise some nature-based approaches such as restoring forests or wetlands or soils. These are some of the remit or gambit of approaches and technologies under that carbon dioxide removal bracket. But there are significant limitations because some of these scenarios envisage very significant rollout of these technologies, which, to be frank, at the scale required is very much a question mark at this point in time. Many of the technologies required remain unproven at this stage. For example, Alasdair previously quoted the work of the International Energy Agency, the IEA, cites there are currently 130 direct air capture facilities in operation globally, and these are absorbing 0.01 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. I want to put that in contrast to actually the scale of annual global emissions at the moment. They said that last year that was 37 billion tonnes of CO2 was released last year versus the 0.01 million tonnes that are being sequestered. So you've got 130 facilities that are absorbing a very negligible fraction of global emissions. And we've been developing DACS since the 1990s. We're still very much in sort of R&D demonstration phases. There is a big question mark on whether that area of the market can deliver on what some of these climate scenarios are hoping they can. Focusing on the more natural routes, so agriculture and forestry and land use changes. We know that we're living in an increasingly sort of finite world in terms of space, lots of competing uses for land, from food to infrastructure development, energy and biomass production, and then starting to build into that requirements for mass restoration of land to forests or wetlands for carbon offsetting becomes a big question mark, and many question that this is unrealistic, given the conflicting uses of land and the sheer volume of land required, or that are being baked into some of these scenarios, that there simply won't be enough land to deliver this. And then once that is delivered, there may be issues with saturation. So, for example, a forest will absorb lots of emissions up to a point, and at that point it becomes saturated and the further potential of that land is lost. But you still need to hold that carbon sort of in semi-permanence for extended long periods of time for it to continue to have a climate impact. So I think ultimately the key takeaway is that many of these assumptions may be unrealistic, and we can't continue to kick the can down the road in terms of decarbonisation. I think the key point being we need to significantly decarbonise today, rather than continuing under business as usual and assuming that future technologies or approaches will at some point kick in and be delivered at scale and sort of save the planet, as you were. So we're walking into the unknown a bit in that area, and there's been a lot of critique in that. So I think some of the scenarios are trying to sort of scale back that reliance on carbon dioxide removal. But I'd say that's probably the key one in terms of transition risks.
Yeah. Alasdair, I mean, from your perspective then, I mean, we've got in the next couple of years, obviously, the introduction of TCFD, and that's going to come in the way in which that's going to impact the way businesses address this, the way they report on all of this sort of stuff. I mean, how important is it from your perspective for clients to take a proactive approach on this? I mean, we're talking about kicking the can down the road. I mean, what's your kind of message there?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. It's important for clients to take a proactive approach to this. I think, despite some pushback in places that we've seen, we've also seen, as Leah said, particularly in the UK, a lot of discussion that we're not treating this seriously enough. And I think it's only going to become more important, particularly to regulators over the next few years. So it's going to be something that clients have to do. So getting ahead of that and making sure you understand it is really important. And not just from the regulatory point of view, but also if you're going to put in all of that that work and that analysis to understand these scenarios, making sure that you get more benefit out of that is going to be really important. But I think if you do just treat this as a kind of tick box exercise and do sort of the very minimum and don't have a good understanding of what's actually going on, of the assumptions that are being made and the sensitivities to those, then I think it's going to be quite difficult to explain the results and to justify them, to the regulator, to your board, to your investors. But also, if you do start trying to use these for business planning, you could, really draw the wrong conclusions from them. So, I mean, as Leah says, there's a lot of things we're not necessarily capturing very well yet, but also there's a lot that you can do with the scenarios we do have to try to understand some of that uncertainty. So, for example, each of the NGFS scenarios have been run with 3 different underlying models, and these all make quite different assumptions around how we, perform that transition. So I said earlier, things like the role for hydrogen or the role for nuclear, they also have different views around things like land use change and carbon dioxide removal. So how much biomass there will be, how much of that will be captured and kind of stored. So if you look across these different models, you can start to see a range of different views. We might think they're all a bit optimistic compared to the historical record, but they certainly do have quite different views of how far that could be extended. So you can start to see how the sensitivity changes when you do change that assumption. We can also do things like look across, a bigger range of scenarios. The IEA have their own scenarios, as do groups like the UNPRI produce a forecast policy scenario, which they just updated this autumn. And those are built in a slightly different way than the NGFS scenarios, maybe more kind of bottom up, looking at the individual technologies and trying to project what's realistic for those to grow over the next kind of 30, 40 years. So that gives you another view. So looking across these different scenarios, looking across some of the scenarios used by the IPCC, really understanding that range of possible outcomes, I think gives you a better understanding of, how realistic some of these things are, and also how material they're going to be for you.
And in terms of your perspective there, Laura, I'm interested to have a look at or have a think about what's happening over the next couple of years and what you expect to see. I know it's a very, very broad question, but in terms of the way in which clients are kind of engaging with this and understanding with this, are you expecting to see greater engagement? Are you expecting to see perhaps a little bit more emphasis on some of the opportunities that might be opening up? I mean, it's a crystal ball exercise, I suppose, but I mean, what's your take on what's in store over the next couple of years, particularly with the background of TCFD coming in?
I think my view here is that momentum is growing. So I don't think that this is going to be something that goes away or pressures diminish. I think it's going to be something that pressures will only increase to have some knowledge or perform some of these kind of stresses. I think that right now the industry as a whole are all in a steep early part of the learning curve. And it's probably advantageous to join in now while everyone's learning, and start at least trying to get a handle on some of the basics and some of the modelling that's done. As we've probably touched on a few times now, the modelling is complex, and as we're recognising issues or deficiencies in some aspects of the modelling, the complexity might only increase. If you start recognising you're not modelling something well, you come back in and think about how do we make this a bit better, there'll be more modelling components to it. And I think as well that it's also something that some of our clients are doing in a phased approach. So, if this isn't going away, if it's only going to get more complex, learning a lot of complexity up front and doing everything right from the beginning is a hard thing to do, but starting the ball rolling now with, doing something, learning from that, and then incrementally increasing what you're doing as you get more and more familiar familiar with what you're working with. And as this all evolves in the background, as the regulatory landscape changes, I can only see that as a positive thing. I guess from so much of what we said, it's not necessarily an easy thing to get a grasp of, and it's something that's definitely better started than deferred further on down the road. From our side as well, we're seeing this growing. We see it as a very active area of growth. We have more and more and more clients coming to us on a monthly basis, asking for information on how they can perform these kind of stresses in a variety of contexts, and how they can get alignment across their business with the way that different teams are all thinking about incorporating these stresses. So yeah, for us, it's growing and it's not going away.
Would you echo that, Leah? Are you expecting to see? I mean, obviously, it's going to be a busy time over the next couple of years, particularly with TCFD coming in. How do you see your next kind of 18 months, 2 years sort of panning out?
Yeah, I think Laura and Alasdair have really perfectly touched on how complex climate change modelling is alone. But I think what the industry is also now grappling with is things coming down the line around nature-related modelling as well. So, looking at developments in the nature space, UK investors are primarily looking at the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures, which is the nature-related equivalent of the TCFD. This is currently voluntary, but we know that in the government's green agenda that they have explicitly stated that the framework would be used as the basis to consider developments in the regulatory environment, which may or may not impact on our clients down the road. I think the main ask that we're getting from those clients really is that any nature-related requirements are embedded and integrated alongside climate change requirements, so that we're not doubling up on efforts to produce, two different reports. And in the same way, we need to look at modelling in the same way. If we're looking at models that can holistically capture, environmental risks and opportunities for investors, as opposed to sort of doubling up those exercises. The problem being at the moment, I'd say nature is much more nascent than climate change modelling. There are a couple key developments that we can touch on in this space. In particular, the TNFD are explicitly looking at interrelated climate and nature scenarios, and some are synergistic in that they're saying, global climate and nature goals can be synergistically delivered, and there are co-benefits there, but they'll also look at scenarios where actually there may be trade-offs, and a siloed focus on climate change and decarbonisation, for example, could actually come at the expense of nature-related outcomes. So I think that's quite interesting. There's also the international body of global scientists leading our understanding on sort of global nature degradation, which is the IPBES, or the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Quite a mouthful, but they've been focusing on the interrelationship of nature and social aspects, actually, just thinking on different scenarios in which, maybe we can have a symbiotic relationship with nature where we value nature and that's integrated into the way that we operate as a society and economy. But they're also looking at other scenarios where, we see nature just as a utility, a use or a benefit for people and societies. And actually we might sort of then start to sort of pillage a little more into what we need. So I think what's quite interesting is these bodies are looking already at the interrelationships with climate change, social factors, and problems will remain around that, and the complexity of nature modelling, and these will share a lot of commonalities with climate change. For example, tipping points, are those adequately monitored? Or also localization is a very unique point in nature, a localized river versus a coastal ecosystem versus a forest. These are very different localized habitats. So how do you properly model that in a sort of global top-down model? Whereas climate change models are focusing on global emissions, that sort of translates relatively well into a global approach, but is the same true for these localized nature habitats? So a lot to think about, but I guess just watch the space, because I think, frustratingly, however complex it is now, it might actually just become more complex with time as we start to grapple with some of the wider sustainability systemic issues beyond climate change as well.
Absolutely. Well, as you say, lots to think about, and we've just sort of scratched the surface here on this on this podcast, but it's a good start. So I suppose to wrap up, it just remains for me to thank my three panelists who've given us such insight: Alasdair Thompson, Leah Worrall, and Laura Tadrowski, and also to thank you for listening. Thank you very much for sparing us the time. There will be further podcasts to come down the line, but for the time being, thank you very much and goodbye.
This episode is in partnership with Moody's Analytics. Moody's on Climate Solutions deliver transparent and robust data, analytics and insights designed to integrate into your existing business workflows. The foundation of our value is data and our approach to financial quantification of risk. Navigate climate risk with confidence, trusted data, financial insight, better decisions.